BBC's Comic Relief Day will be back in March, raising money for poor and disadvantaged people around the world. And this year it will feature the return of a familiar face.
What are you going to be then, sir? The noble Tommy?
Precisely. Standing over the body of the ravaged nun.
I want a wimple.
Well, you should have gone before we started the picture.
You know, the funny thing is, my father was a nun.
No, he wasn't.
He was so, sir. I know, because whenever he was up in court and the judge used to say occupation, he'd say none.
Yeah, so that's Blackadder's inept sidekick Baldrick, played by Tony Robinson. He'll be making his first appearance for 20 years, although Blackadder himself will not be making what would be an eagerly awaited return. So here to discuss this, I'm joined by Aaron Brown from the British Comedy Guide. What does it say? I mean, we also had recently John Cleese talking about the return of Fawlty Towers in a new form, and now Baldrick is propping up again in Comic Relief. I mean, does this suggest that there aren't many characters or shows that are more recent that that are as beloved as those, I suppose?
I think it probably does. I mean, for as long as Comic Relief has existed, it has brought up classics of the past.
Yes.
For example, on, I think it was the second Comic Relief telethon in 1988, they included a whole half hour of a full episode repeat of Dad's Army.
Right.
So it's never been above looking back to popular comedies and comedians of the past. I think the difference here is that this is almost the only thing we actually know about, because there are so few popular comedies that they can make specials of.
Yeah. I mean, there's no harm, is there, in bringing back these old beloved characters?
No.
That's absolutely fine, and it's for a good cause. But, I remember recently there was a big thing on Twitter where people were talking about all the great things that the BBC had done for comedy, and this was because we were talking about getting rid of the licence fee, and people were listing loads of amazing comedies, but they were all 30 years old and more.
Yeah. It's difficult to get past that once you first notice it.
Yeah.
I tend to think there is very little today that you can't make an argument for deserving to exist, deserving to be made and broadcast on its own merit. But taken as a whole, it's quite an unsatisfying comedy meal.
Yeah.
There isn't much diversity in tone or style. There are a lot of programmes that are ostensibly sitcoms, much more in the vein of comedy drama in reality, that feature people working in or around comedy, the media, 20-something, living in London, almost always unlucky in love.
Yes.
And, you know, say, these programmes, they're often very well written. Some of them I really like, some of them don't do much for me. And individually, I wouldn't say that any of them are awful, but it's that lack of diversity.
Yeah, it's not to suggest there aren't talented people working in the industry, but rather that there's nothing really that stands out as something that will stand the test of time as genius, or something that is indeed laugh out loud funny. I wonder to what degree, I mean, we've seen the cancellation of Mock the Week, but, you know, a lot of comedians have become, I suppose, preachers rather than comedians. A lot of comedy commissioners have become activists rather than comedy commissioners. I mean, I see them tweet all the time about white privilege and gender ideology and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It does narrow the scope of what kind of comedy you're going to get.
Yeah, it's very much a monoculture amongst the creative gatekeepers, commissioners, producers. So you get very little that is reflective of anything outside the kind of stereotype of the metropolitan elite.
Yeah, well,
university educated.
I mean, last week we had Samantha Presti, the comedian, and she'd published an article on Chortle, and people won't know that's an industry website where comedians often just write articles and submit them, and they put them up, and it's absolutely fine. But this was the only time I've ever seen the editor of Chortle step in and write a comment saying how much he disagreed with this, because her view was not the fashionable view, and his view is very much in line with the identitarian, illiberal, modern movement that has captured the industry. So Is that just evidence of what's going on? And by the way, her show was then cancelled because she had unpopular views.
Yeah, it's quite ironic that you say you're quitting comedy because you don't feel that you fit in and that people aren't saying anything that is pushing boundaries.
Yes.
And then you get cancelled for doing so.
Yes. But they proved your point, didn't they, rather?
Exactly, they did. I mean, you're quite right. It's really... I mean, it's just so unhealthy. It's comedy... Comedians are supposedly telling truth unto power. You know, comedy comes from the kind of heritage, the idea of the court jester, the person who was able to... prick the pomposity of the king and bring them down to the if not the common man's level, then at least the lords and ladies level.
Yes.
But there doesn't seem to be much of that anymore. There's a lot of singing from the same hymn sheet.
And that's an important point, isn't it, that you make, that, you know, we have now an industry that is run or dominated by not just commissioners and promoters, but critics as well, who actually want the jester to toe the establishment line.
Yeah.
They don't want the king to be criticised.
Yeah, more a ringmaster than a jester, keeping up appearances. I mean, you say that there have been certain changes around. You've seen the BBC was forced to move various operations out to Manchester, Channel 4 to Leeds. Yet the people who are still staffing these institutions, still in the decision-making roles, no matter whether they are from the north, from London, from the south, from Scotland, no matter their class background, no matter their sex, their sexuality, they all seem to have exactly the same outlook, worldview, and that is what's feeding in to such a staid and just stifling
it's boring,
comedy environment.
It is. It's boring, and also, you know, part of their worldview is, in fact, that those who disagree with them should not be platformed. So you will never get that diversity that you're looking for.
Absolutely. It's completely true. If you look at, like, ratings for... not just comedy, but I think it is particularly acutely a problem in comedy, for television ratings. So you might get 5 million people, for example, watched the live final of The Masked Singer on ITV last night. Contemporary comedy, I mean, maybe at a push, a hit show will get 1.5 million.
Right.
And they say... But they excuse it by saying people just don't watch television anymore, it's all on catch-up. Well, the likes of Call the Midwife or The Masked Singer or Happy Valley, any of these big-ticket shows prove that there are audiences there and that they do tune in, and in huge numbers, just like they did 20 years ago, just like they did 30 years ago, if the programming is there that appeals to them.
Yeah, but they'd rather watch some Z-lister doing karaoke in a mask. Depressing.
Apparently so.
Anyway, Aaron Brown, thanks very much for joining me tonight. Really appreciate it.